With persistence and vision at 24 frames per second, film emerged out of a celluloid silence to find its voice. As it moved from the nickel parlor to lavish palaces, arts and crafts and business collaborated to capture the minds and imaginations of mass audiences, collaborated to make their imprint on culture and on society's glittering path. When the new box on the block appeared, film at first stepped back and then leaped forward with new vigor and new audiences for its product. Throughout the 20th century, the storytelling medium has alternately flourished and faded, and each time emerged stronger than before. Early films captured the illusion of motion. Inventors designed primitive devices to create simple visual storytelling. One of the first sequences, by Edward Muybridge, set the stage frame by frame for what would affectionately come to be known as the movies. Later, Thomas Edison and his assistant, William Dixon, recrafted an invention of the Lumiere brothers into a practical movie projector.
The movie industry started out as an attempt to control patents all the way back in the 19th century with Thomas Edison and those guys. They thought that they could create an industry around the control of patent rights for the projector and the movie camera. When that didn't succeed, when the immigrant filmmakers were trying to run circles around them and pretty well succeeding, they fell out of the picture. And the immigrant filmmakers that really were sneaking around New York and the wilds of New Jersey making movies and importing them from Europe, they came onto their own in the late teens and created what today is the American movie industry.
Knowledge TV Retro, brought to you by Jones International University, the first fully online accredited university. Change your life for the better on your schedule. 8-week classes begin next month. Visit jiu.edu to find out more.
With the admission price of 5 cents, Nickelodeon's peep shows and penny arcades sprang up in cities across the country. While they attracted many viewers, one at a time, these flickering films were far from being a mass medium.
The film industry in the United States began around 1896, give or take a year or two here and there. Some of the first films were very short, provocative in the sense that it was such a new thing. It was like a toy, and people would actually go into tents and sit on wooden benches on muddy fields and watch this this thing.
Most of the people who went to the movies were immigrants, and it was the silent movies. It was the way they learned English, because they could see the action on the screen, and then they could read the titles that were written, weren't spoken. So they listened to the music and read, and it's one of the ways that early immigrants in this country learned English.
In the early 1900s, filmmakers experimented with the fledgling medium. Some were fanciful, like Georges Méliès's Trip to the Moon, and captured the audience's imagination with simple visual effects. One early film in particular, Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, helped define the intercutting language of the film narrative. Above all, in the early years, filmmakers learned that what the medium of film could do best was to tell stories to mass audiences.
The Great Train Robbery in 1903, that was the first Western that used interior-exterior shots, had moving background, and of course at the end, the bank robber points his gun out the audience and shoots. And this was very frightening to the audience at the time, because they had no idea how powerful film was. They actually thought this bank robber was shooting directly at them.
Well, that's the first one that has a beginning, middle, and end, I guess, except, of course, the beginning and the end are the same, so that it could be shown as a loop. Now you could have little stories in one reel, as opposed to the Nickelodeon, or just seeing a train come into a station and two actors, an actor and actress, kiss, or Little Egypt or a fan dance, that kind of thing. No, it's a plot that makes the difference.
Comfortably based in a dramatic setting, film began to attract large audiences in search of diversion. By developing its own storytelling techniques, filled with realism, action, and compelling plots, Filmmakers like D.W. Griffith began to invent a new film language for communicating with mass audiences. His 3-hour epic, Birth of a Nation, was seen by 24 million people in its first 2 years, more than all of the stage plays in the country's history.
That film just upset everyone. It upset everyone's apple cart. You know, it has racial overtones to it. People were angry with his presentation of blacks in the film. But what was important about him was his camera work, the interior, the exterior shots, the extreme close-ups, the medium shot, the panoramic shots, the iris in, the iris out, the masking. He rehearsed his actors, and so the film was longer. It had a story.
One could go on, and people have, at great length on D.W. Griffith, because he didn't invent all these devices. I mean, there are people who had done close-ups, there are people who had changed angles, had done full-length features, but he was the guy who put it all together and made it famous around the world.
Birth of a Nation was that kind of a transitional film. Griffith basically both invented and learned from others how to create a film grammar that the audience understood, what a close-up means, what alternating close-ups mean, and what a point of view shot is.
Filmmakers also found that when communicating in silence, comedy is a universal language. Charlie Chaplin and other film actors became more famous, more recognizable to more people than any live performers that the world had ever known.
The early films of Chaplin were transitional in the sense that they created the movie star and the idea of a worldwide audience for the movie star. There have been stars before Chaplin, but Chaplin was the first great movie star.
Actors in feature films gave audiences what they wanted: more action, more thrills, more emotional excitement. Harold Lloyd defied death with his Chaplin-esque antics, long before there were stuntmen and stand-ins. Mass audiences soon learned to project their lives onto screen actors. Starlets like America's sweetheart Mary Pickford won the adoration of a nation. And when a star died, the nation mourned. Studio heads were quick to realize that successful screen performers could attract huge audiences and bring in millions of dollars. Soon, the studios were promoting their stars more than the actual films in which they appeared. When sound came to film, the audience's perceptions of the cinematic experience were radically changed. The medium became more expressive, able to entertain mass audiences in new ways, and able to tell them ever more intricate stories.
There's the coming of sound in 26 and 27. That radically changes what has become, by that point, an incredibly brilliant visual form of expression, and where the camera had learned to move and created incredibly fluid and beautiful kinds of arcs and curves through space, and presented characters through amazing lighting and close-up.
Many directors did not want to make talkies. Not because there were guys who said, let's get a good picture here, say something now, Fred. No, hardly. They felt like they had perfected a visual storytelling medium that was universal.
One of the best films that was ever made was Singing in the Rain, which is a spoof on the advent of sound. It really does tell what happened, you know, the breakdown of sound, the influence of sound in the industry. We
have all heard about the fallout of silent film actors and actresses who, playing ethereal heroines, were suddenly revealed to have nasal Bronx accents and so forth, you know. Or people who couldn't deliver dialogue, or where the voice didn't match the image. It was a big shakeout.
told you not to make that last payment.
Audiences flocked to local theaters in ever greater numbers, drawn by stars, spectacle, and sound. As films generated more and more money, filmmaking rapidly became big business.
The first really important move, at least in the American context, was the industrialization of cinema, which started in around 1910. We get an assembly line, essentially, or the basic components of an assembly line, a kind of factory notion, which gives us the Hollywood studio. The person that's generally credited with seeing the kind of shape of business practice that would turn into the factory system and that followed in certain ways from the whole sort of industrialization of America with Henry Ford and the like is Thomas Ince, who is very often credited with the inception of a standardized form of production.
The studio system, which was the notion of making movies in a factory system where you had A pictures that were prestige pictures and B pictures that were bread and butter, cheaper pictures, and movie theaters that were not owned by the movie company were only able to get the A pictures if they also accepted the B pictures. Okay? That lasted through the 1940s.
You could churn out a lot of films, some bad, some brilliant, on an annual basis and have a great deal of control over what Hollywood increasingly called the product.
Throughout the 1930s, a handful of companies dominated the movie-making business from studios and back lots in Southern California. Tight-fisted studio heads controlled the stars that the movie-going public wanted to see, telling them the stories that they wanted to hear.
The movies, of course, have always been star-based. Going back to Chaplin, going back to Mary Pickford, the stars have always been the iron core of the movies. And through the 20s, names that are now largely forgotten, John Gilbert and Colleen Moore. I mean, Shirley Temple probably made 20th Century Fox, though they had their own company of stars, and MGM's slogan was, more stars than there are in the heavens.
It's always been star-driven, but so you see the industry ran the stars. They were under contract. They're the ones who cleaned up the messes and bribed the gossip columnists and covered up stuff, but then also started the publicity machine growing, groomed them for certain things.
Studios used to create their own stars by putting them in a lot of films. Jimmy Stewart made 5 films his first year in Hollywood, so did Cagney. There was no sort of breeding ground for stars, and they just sort of happened accidentally, but then they became very hot. And when a star had been in 1 or 2 movies that made a lot of money, then he got a lot more money, and you began to see all these star vehicles in which the star, dominated the film and the sale and the promotion and so on.
The power of stars to attract large audiences was phenomenal. By mid-20th century, over 100 million viewers attended movies each week in the United States. Creative filmmakers sought new ways to attract and engage those audiences.
The film I admire the most is still, after all is said and done, Citizen Kane. And I think that the reason for that is that it's, yes, all of that technical razzle-dazzle that Wells brought to it, the deep focus and all that kind of stuff. It's all wonderful. But the point is, and I think this goes back to the script by Herman Mankiewicz, in the beginning is the word, is that it is a fascinating human document.
The influence of Kane, if only to encourage people around the world, has been gigantic. It influenced camera work, editing, photography, and it's still just a big fat benchmark.
While many appreciated cinematic creativity, the studios knew that what audiences really wanted were films that told familiar stories in more or less predictable ways. Controlling business interests produced most films by genre to attract particular segments of the viewing public.
The early film noirs in the 1940s created an entire genre, one of the 3 American genres, the musical, the western, and the film noir. It was the only American genre that was not self-conscious. People making film noir didn't know they were making film noir. It was named that by the French many years later. Robert Mitchum once said, we just called them B pictures. And yet they contained a whole set of attitudes and a visual approach that was very distinctive. So the very early ones, like Double Indemnity, were probably quite influential.
American films in particular are genre-bound. I mean, the American movies, I think, are famous for having created certain genre that meet audience expectations and also fit the highly capital-intensive production realities of Hollywood filmmaking. Here you know the kind of film that you're getting because the advertising is telling you the genre, the star is telling you the genre, because American films have evolved the system of genre. And that is that you know what you're getting.
Throughout the 1940s, Hollywood studios continued to dominate filmmaking, nurturing their stars and, for the most part, feeding the public the types of films it wanted to see most. However, this studio-based star system was not to last.
People didn't want to be a member of a stable. People were making a lot of money, felt that they could make their own films the way they wanted to make it, how they wanted to make it, and where they wanted to make it. Suddenly, location became cheaper than staying in Hollywood, California. I think the breakdown also came with the passing away of big heads of studios. It just wasn't feasible to keep large studios going. It was more expensive. You had to have stables of writers, you had to have stables of stars, you had to have stables of technicians.
There was a decree in the late 1940s called the Paramount Decree, which in essence divested Paramount of the ability to control all aspects of the production, exhibition, and distribution of films. And that had a tremendous impact on the industry as a whole, because what that did over time, and it didn't happen right away, it transformed the very nature of the industry, so that it signaled the breakdown of this large, studio hold over the entertainment film.
To maintain its mass audience, throughout most of the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood diligently attempted to keep its stories safe for all audiences.
We worked with producers, authors, scenario writers, directors, and all who are connected with the production, to the end that the finished product may be free from reasonable objections.
The Hays Code and the watchful eye of the Catholic Church's Legion of Decency helped keep filmmakers in line for a time.
Who really, I think, did as much as anybody else to break the system was Otto Preminger. And he first made a simple little comedy called The Moon is Blue about a girl who's using her virginity as a kind of bargaining tool for marriage. And it was an innocuous thing. I mean, it would be tamed by the standards of Seinfeld, certainly. But he released it without a seal, and in his modest way, it was perfectly successful. But he more significantly then did The Man with the Golden Arm with Frank Sinatra as a junkie card dealer in Chicago, talking about the 35-pound monkey on his back of addiction.
You mustn't take that dirty stuff no more.
I know, you're right. And I promise. But right now I need a fix, just one fix.
Probably the best film that's ever been made about drug addiction. And, of course, under the code of the old Hays Code, you couldn't deal with narcotics in any form, even to attack it, so that he couldn't get a seal, but he released it, of course.
While many in the film industry had been seeking freedom from external controls, in the 1950s, they fell under the scrutiny of zealous anti-communist investigators in the U.S. Senate. Actors, writers, directors, and even studio heads were asked to name names of those they knew in the film industry who might be communist or communist sympathizers. Hollywood was intimidated. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood had churned out nearly 500 feature films per year. Business was booming. By 1946, paid admissions reached over $1.5 billion. That same year, only 11,000 television sets were sold nationwide. Within a few years, however, theater ticket sales would plummet as Americans stayed home to get their fill of information and entertainment. The film industry saw television as a rival, and for good reason.
What changed everything about Hollywood was television. It's simple as that, because up through 1946, the movies were the mass medium of entertainment. We all went to the movies all the time, every time the program changed in the smaller towns. And suddenly here, taking Hollywood unawares, amazingly enough, came television.
In the 1940s, people went to the movies 3 times a week. Every neighborhood in cities had movie theaters. People would just show up. It was like watching television. Kids would go on Saturday morning. By the 1950s, that no longer existed. People started watching television. In 1945, almost no one had a TV set. By the end of the 1950s, almost 90% of American society had television sets.
To compete with the new medium and win back their audiences, Hollywood experimented with new formats, new screen shapes and sizes. Film content went from tame to torrid. Sex and violence, prohibited on television, hit the movies with a bang.
Hollywood reacted to the advent of television with panic and concern and with technological innovation. They introduced widescreen and 3D, which were attempts to show you things in movie theaters that you couldn't possibly see on a television screen. Widescreen had success. 3D had some box office success, but has never been much more than a gimmick, really, artistically.
In 1946, which is right as television was starting to be introduced, it was a high point of the motion picture industry in terms of culture. That it was a leading spectator amusement. You know, more people watched movies than did any other form of entertainment. Once television came on, because of the cost differential, all of a sudden movies became more elite, and television became the art form of the medium of the masses.
Hollywood also began to stretch the boundaries of subject matter beyond what you could see in television. It was generally true that up until about 1950, most movies were what would now be called PG or PG-13, with a few exceptions, of course. But Hollywood began with movies like Streetcar Named Desire and others to make more adult subject matter, because they confidently felt that they were making movies now that could never be shown on television, and of course sex sells and controversy sells, and people would come to see that.
Studios also quickly realized that if they couldn't beat television at entertaining mass audiences, they could join them. Because television presented new markets for old films, Hollywood's archives were suddenly in demand. On the small screen,
the studios began to realize that television was a source of revenue, and the movie of the week started, and they would sell a movie after a certain length of time to a television network which would show it, and that was profitable.
Suddenly studios realized that they had this wonderful archive and library of films that were now product again, rather than just old last year's news.
Then the Hollywood studios got into the business of producing television. They would make a half-an-hour weekly series, an hour weekly series. The movies of the week came along in the 60s, and suddenly maybe half of the people on the back lot would be working on television any given week instead of on movies.
From their television production divisions, major film studios used their know-how in producing filmed entertainment to create programming, promote stars, and make money. In the late 1970s, the film industry received an unexpected challenge from another new medium, home video. Suddenly, mass audiences were able to go to the movie of their choice in the comfort of their own homes.
At first, video created a real panic in the eyes of the movie industry, because they felt that it was, it's television all over again, you know, that's going to destroy us. So what happened in the late 70s when video and paid television first came in, people panicked thinking, well, we'll drop again. That really didn't happen, and in fact, it revitalized film going to a certain extent, in that it aged it. So people for the last decade who had kids stop going to movies, all of a sudden caught up on all the movies that they hadn't seen before.
And what was amazing was the more people rented movies on video, the more they started going back to the theaters. In fact, in the middle and late 70s, Hollywood was very concerned because their demographics indicated that more and more of the movie audiences were consisting of younger people on dates, teenagers, and people in their 20s, and the adult audience wasn't going to the movies. Then they had an interesting phenomenon. They brought out a movie in 1982 called Terms of Endearment, and it opened very, very strongly. And they did some exit polling to find out why people had a great desire to go see this movie, and they expected people would say things like, I'm a Shirley MacLaine fan, or I'm a Jack Nicholson fan. And a large number of people said, well, we saw An Officer and a Gentleman on video, and so we wanted to see Deborah Winger's new movie. An Officer and a Gentleman had been the #1 renting video the previous 12 months, and they realized videos were acting like trailers.
So, once again, the film industry had not just battled a potential foe, but turned it into a market opportunity for distributing their product and extending their reach. Today, the film industry faces yet another challenge, this time from new media. High technology that gives potential movie-going customers new diversions. But this time, the film industry seems to be moving ahead with the assumption that new media means new markets. The silver screen's first 100 years have been a roller coaster ride. Storytelling on celluloid has gone from simple, flickering vignettes to high Hollywood drama. Along the way, film has faced challenges for its audiences and found ways to expand its markets. Today, the film industry carries on the same tradition of capturing our minds and imaginations, reflecting and projecting our culture, and entertaining mass audiences with new but familiar stories.
What shall I do? Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Knowledge TV Retro, brought to you by Jones International University, the first fully online accredited university. Change your life for the better on your schedule. 8-week classes begin next month. Visit jiu.edu to find out more.